Hey everyone, thank you for joining us. I'm Kim. This is Lisa. There we go. Welcome to Read It Again's online author series. I would like to welcome Lisa Wingate. We're here to talk about the book of Lost Friends. Welcome, Lisa. Can you hear me all right?
Thank you for having me. Happy, what is this, Tuesday?
It
yes,
is Tuesday.
I can hear you fine.
Good.
It started to get, yeah, I know. The days of the week are like this day, that day, the next day. It all runs together now.
It does. And your book has been out a week, right? It came out last Tuesday.
Yes.
Well,
it did. It did. So we are at the 1 week birthday. Thank you.
I read the book. I finished it 2 days ago. And guys, I have to say, I love this book. You need to go out right now and get it. We have copies that Read It Again. See? Lisa was originally scheduled to come to our store and have an event right now at this time on this day here in the store where I am. But that didn't happen. It's okay. Lisa promises that she's going to come back later when times are different. So Lisa, what's it like having a best-selling book come out right now?
Strange, definitely. This is not, normally when a book comes out, you're running around airports and in hotels and out talking to readers. And so you're sharing that experience live with all these people. And all of that was planned. And so March tumbled into this big debate of, do we cancel things? What do we cancel? And then pretty soon it was everything is canceled. And then it was the 1st of April was, how can we do some things virtually to talk to readers and share it? So it's been a very strange, surreal experience to realize the book is actually coming out in the middle of everything that's going on. But in some ways, I also think we need books more than ever. We need things that settle our minds and take us away and give us hope and just let our minds rest a little bit from everything that's going on in the real world.
I totally agree. We are still here. We're still selling books. We're not letting people into the store, but we have curbside delivery and we are delivering books locally to people. Like yesterday, I delivered 4 puzzles and 4 books. I just drove to people's houses and dropped them on the front door, texted them to say that they were there. We have to adapt. That's what we're doing. That's why we're doing this interview from your living room and the kids section of my bookstore. So, Lisa, can you tell us a little bit about your new book?
So the Book of Lost Friends, I never know what will inspire a book, and it's never, it's always some spark, and I don't know what will spark a book. And I don't really know it till I hear it. If I went looking for it, I would probably never find it, but something will come along. And usually it's a story someone tells me or shares with me, a personal story, a piece of history. When I travel around, people will, tell me pieces of history from their family or their town, and something will just spark in me and blow my mind wide open. And I think I need to know more. And that's where Before We Were Yours, the previous book, came about. I came across this woman in Memphis who had run this adoptions for profit ring for 30 years and stolen thousands of these children that she put out there as orphans and made money adopting. And, it just kind of blew my mind. But how does something like that happen? So the Book of Lost Friends, it was actually a reader of Before We Were Yours who brought me this piece of history, real life Lost Friends ads that once again just blew my mind wide open. And it came along in the middle of ordinary life after Before We Were Yours came out. I was working on another book, which was to be my next book. And I was just procrastinating one day, honestly, on the back porch, procrastinating, working on the other book. And I opened an email, and it was a letter from a reader who had just finished Before We Were Yours. And she said, there's another piece of history about separated families trying to find one another, and I think you should know about it. And what she had been doing was digitizing these Lost Friends ads for the Historic New Orleans collection into the Lost Friends database. So out there on the internet, you're showing it, is this database of these advertisements that ran from the 1870s up through the early 1900s. And what they were the letters to the editor from formerly enslaved people at post-Civil War during Reconstruction. And they're trying desperately to find their relatives they've been separated from, sometimes decades ago during slavery. And so, many of these people, all they know is the last known whereabouts of their relatives, the last known name those people were being called or were going by. And they send these to the editor of the Lost Friends column. The paper travels out across the South and Southwestern states to hundreds of churches, hundreds of post offices. It's posted, thousands of subscribers. Pastors are requested to read the ads from the pulpits of their churches. And so it's this early day social media wall, basically, to put the word out there so that if anyone out there has information of these people, of these long lost loved ones, they can write to the person who placed the ad and send them the information and hopefully reconnect these families. So that became the basis for the story. When I heard about it, she had attached a few ads to the email, and I read a few of those ads that she had been recently digitizing. And then I went to the database link, and it just blew my mind wide open, because I love history. I know a lot of history. I was completely unaware of this piece of history, the Lost Friends column, and how it was used.
You there?
Yeah, I'm here.
I was wrapped up in the ads. So,
me too. That's where the book came from.
I was reading them this morning, and I was sitting there crying. They're so tragic, and they're haunting. I think I saw you say in an interview that the woman who suggested them to you, she couldn't do too many in one day because it was just too emotional. Yeah.
That's what she said. She said two things in her early correspondence with me. One of them was, there's a story in every one of these ads. And she's so right. Every one of these little squares of paper is the story of a family and what happened to them. And there are over 2,500 in the database. So tens of thousands of people's stories, because most of these were big families and they were separated all over the place. And so the stories of tens of thousands of people survive in these little squares of newsprint, these people who are gone from the earth, and whose stories, may or may not be remembered by descendants at this point, whose names quite likely were not even recorded on gravestones. These people who are, they're gone, and their stories are often gone. And then they resurface out of these dusty file cabinets and university archives in these newspaper ads. And Diane Plochet, the woman who brought me the ads, said, I can only do so many at once because it just gets so emotional. And it does when you read them and you realize the desperation these people felt, the need to find out about their families, how long so many of them had been waiting and hoping, elder women in their 50s and 60s who'd been separated from their mothers when they were tiny children, still hoping that they might find, their mother or their father out there. siblings that were separated as little children, still hoping they might find news of their siblings, elderly people just wanting to know, do I have anybody, any kin left in the world? I'm all alone in the world, but I think I must have some people out there. I mean, it's so emotional when you really internalize the fact that these are the stories of people and what happened to them in their own words.
We, my family and I were watching Just Mercy. We read the book for our nonfiction book club, and then we watched the movie recently. And it's a hard story to watch. My kids, they're teenagers. They're like, "Mom, I don't know if we can do this." And I told them, you have to sit there and you have to watch it, because this happened to these people, and you have to experience it because it is an actual thing that actually happened. You have to watch it. So I feel like we have to read it. It is our historical, we just have to. We this happened to people. We need to experience it. Did you get your inspiration? Did it come from a specific ad or just several ads in general?
So I thought originally, I have a whole drawer full of notes and scraps of paper of neat things that I think would make good stories, or that might be the fodder for a book or whatever. And I really thought the Lost Friends ads would be my next book. I would finish the one I was working on, and then I would dig into this. And every so often, Diane would send me, and it was very busy. I was traveling a lot before We Were Yours had made the bestseller list by then. So I was traveling, but just a lot was going on. And Diane every so often would send me ads she was digitizing, when she found one that just particularly struck her. And she sent me the ad one day of a woman named Caroline Flowers. And Caroline Flowers' story, it was a very long, detailed ad compared to some of them. And it's the story of this large family with a batch of siblings and the parents who are who are stolen from the owner of the plantation by a nephew who grabs them and flees with them. And as he's fleeing, he basically is just selling them here and there in ones and twos as he flees with them. So this is how this family is separated. And in the end, Caroline ends up being held in a jail because it's discovered what's happening, and she ends up being held for the people to come back and get her. And so that was the inspiration. That ad, this idea of this family being taken, basically by a criminal and distributed as he flees, was the inspiration for Hanny. Hanys' story is fictional. Hanny is fictional in the book. And Hanny's ad is the only one in the book that is fictional. The rest of the Lost Friends ads in the book are real ads, the real stories of real families. Hanny's ad is a fictionalized version of Caroline's ad. And it's a reverse story, because in Hanny's case, it's the flight from the river road down in New Orleans to Texas that is when this happens and when this family is separated. The Caroline Flowers ad is actually the opposite. It ran from Texas and ended up distributed going the other direction. But sometimes when you dig into the history, you find where things fit. And in this case, New Orleans and Texas, or Louisiana and Texas, have an interesting Civil War history, because very early on in the war, the federal forces come up the river. And so what happens on a lot of these plantations along the river and a lot of places in Louisiana is people do what they call going refugee. So they grab what they can carry on a riverboat, on wagons, and they flee, including their enslaved people. And they flee to Texas to go refugee. Their theory being that Texas will hold out. Texas will never be conquered or whatever, and Texas will hold out. And when the war is over, then they'll bring all their property back, and including their enslaved people, and come back to life as they knew it. And so many enslaved people were dragged away from where they had been when people went refugee. And so that's what happens to Hanys' family. But as they are supposed to go refugee, they're kidnapped by a nephew of the owner of the plantation, and which begins their troubles. And Hanny being the only one who is actually recovered and ends up back on Goswood Plantation.
I had okay. On your website, I did some digging. You have a whole section dedicated to asking family members about their personal history. And I feel like losing history is like not losing family history, not losing history, holding on to your family past is really important to you. I mean, that was a theme for at least 2 of your books.
Yes, that is a very important theme for me. Partly because my first book, the first book I wrote years ago when I was a young, brand new mom. So I've been around in this business for a long time. This is book number 32 for me, The Book of Lost Friends. But when I started, I was a new mom of, at home with a baby, and now I have big hairy-legged man children and a grandbaby. So that tells you kind of the time frame here. But my first book was a book called Tending Roses, and it was fiction, but the grandmother's stories in it were stories my grandmother told me when she came to stay with me and that baby. And being around that little new person in the family who was the first baby, first grandbaby, first great grandbaby. He was the numero uno primo of our family. And it brought all these stories out of her that I never knew, because my grandmother grew up very poor. She was illiterate until she was 9 years old, and the census workers found her and told her parents they'd have to start sending her to school because it was the law. It was a family with mental illness. It was a family that was looked down on by the town. They were the white trash. Their name was Doyne. People used to call them the dirty Doynes. I never knew these things about my grandmother. She didn't talk about it. Like a lot of Depression era people, she felt like she had left that behind. She had worked really hard in her life. She had married up because she had married a self-subsisting farmer who was also 30 years older than her. So that started a few scandals too. But I never knew these things about my grandmother because she didn't talk about it. She didn't tell those stories. And being around a baby again, because she wanted me to understand what things matter in life and what things what things you need to put your time and attention into, and what things are gone so fast that afterwards you look back on it and think, what happened? It reminded her of all these things, and she started to pour out these stories. And those stories completely changed my perspective. It changed because this was the 90s. I mean, everybody was about yuppie and go and get and buy and achieve, and what kind of car do you drive, and are you keeping up with your, all the people you graduated from high school with, and all those things. And my grandmother gave me this dose of perspective, and she would say, "Oh, Lisa, you have all your life to work, and you have only a few years to be the mother of this baby. Enjoy it. Don't be so driven." And that was my introduction to the stories that you maybe don't know in your family, and B, how much they can mean in your life, how much they can give you fodder for thinking about things, and also just understanding when bad things happen. Those stories are your resource to understand how to survive it and to understand that people in your life have survived horrible events and gone on.
I felt like Benny's goal was to bring history alive for her students, and I feel like you as a writer, correct me if I'm wrong, your goal has been to bring history alive. Because when I read your book, I feel like I am in history. You do such a good job of making it so feel so vivid. I feel like I'm stuck on the boat with them. I feel like I'm stuck on the cart. I feel like I'm gonna get caught. Like, you bring history alive so well. So do you feel a little kinship to Benny, that she wants to bring history alive for her students?
Oh, definitely. I feel a lot of Benny's journey because yeah, I've always been fascinated with history. Um, I've always been fascinated with history and story, and that's what we did when we were kids. I predate cable TV and all that sort of thing. So there was nothing on TV you wanted to watch unless it was Saturday morning and the cartoons were on. There was nothing on TV to watch. So what we kids did with our time was we went out in the yard, and if we had read it in a book or seen it on TV, we just played it by the hour out in the yard. So, we were Tarzan and Zorro and Little House on the Prairie and Spartacus and whatever we had seen on TV, or read about it in a book. We went out in the yard and we lived it. And so for me, I'm just kind of a kid who never grew up. I still have a little bit of that Peter Pan syndrome. It's all very real to me when I'm working on the story. My mind is living in that history. It's living with the characters. It's all very real in my mind. They are all very real in my mind. Sometimes I'll think of them and I'll think after the book is, because readers will ask me, well, what happened to so-and-so after the book? And I'll catch myself thinking, well, what did happen? And then I realized nothing happened because they're not real. They're not out there living their lives somewhere outside the book. But to me, they become that real that they're sort of like relatives I don't see all the time. I expect their lives to be progressing on, even though beyond what happened in the book.
I felt like this was a book I wanted more. I wanted this to be a weekly series where I find out what both timelines are doing. I want to see what their Tuesday afternoon is like. I wanted more.
Oh, that's the best. I love it when people are attached enough to the characters or feel that they're real enough or have an emotional connection with them enough to want to know more about what are they doing, what did they do after the book. That's the best. That means that that experience of reading has become real to you as a reader, and that is when that happens in a book. I think that's the ultimate for reading experience, that it lives with us afterward. It's been proven that when we're really deep in reading, they've done the brain science on that. When you're really deep in reading, if they put the diodes on your brain to measure your brain activity, if you read about diving into a pool of water, your brain is lighting up in the same way as if you were diving into a pool of water for real. So that means when we're really deep in reading, we're building lived experience. That's how books build empathy in us. That's how books build understanding in us. That's how books help us to cross borders and live for a while in the life of another person. We need more books and more deep reading to fix a lot of the things that go on in our country and our world. A lot of the insensitivities that we have toward each other. We just need more of that deep reading.
I loved that Benny was so passionate about books. It was I love that. I'm a bookseller. I really felt myself in that character because she couldn't understand why these kids didn't read more. And I mean, she did understand it after a little bit, but she was like, no, I have to get them to read. Their lives could be better if they just would read a book. They could escape into a book that they can't escape into now. So there was the 80s. They had minimum TV. They didn't have internet. They didn't have cell phones. They needed books. So yeah, I really enjoyed that, actually. So not all your characters were likable, I have to say. I love a likable character. I want to follow them. But you managed to keep me, the reader, really engaged in the narrative. I may not have liked all the characters, but I wanted to know what happened to them. And I'm not going to say what happens, so I'm not going to give it away. You guys have to read it, and I strongly recommend that you pick up a copy of the Book of Lost Friends from your local independent bookstore. But I cared about them in the end. And that's really hard for a writer to do, especially when you write people who aren't necessarily the best at first. They grow throughout the novel. You know?
I think, yeah, part of that is years ago, so Tending Roses was the first book. And then there was a series of 5 that they're not a series, but they're interconnected books. If you read one and then the next one, you'll see characters in the background who were in the first book, but it'll be someone else's story who was part of the supporting cast. So book 3 was going to be about the older sister in this family, Karen, who had been kind of a snot in Tending Roses, honestly. So I started to write about her. My mother, who's one of my beta readers, said, "Why in the world do you want to write about Karen? I don't even like her." And, and that really at that time got me to think, the reason you don't like somebody. And that is one thing I also sort of learned from my grandmother, because I loved my grandmother, but in a lot of ways I didn't like her. She was a fussy she could drive you crazy fussing about mud on your shoes and don't come in here with that horsehair on your pants and, just everything. It seemed like all she did was fuss at us. And lecture us and tell us how spoiled we were and how easy we had it, everything. But what I learned from her is that when you don't like somebody, you don't understand their story well enough, because there is a reason. We are all the way we are each the way we are for a reason. We each look at the world the way we do for a reason. All those things, all those experiences in our lives have painted that lens that we're seeing the world through. And so none of us sees the world clearly. None of us sees reality. We all see a different reality because we're all looking through a different lens. And so part of that becoming understanding or developing understanding for a character you don't like is understanding you may still not like their register on the world. You may still not like the way they think, but you at least know why it's happening.
We have some questions here. We can do a couple of them. Deborah wanted to know, did you ever read or discover successful reunions from your ads? And somebody else, Katie asked the same question.
That question has been asked a lot. There are a few. The very last ad in the book is a reunion ad, because one of the things they requested was that if anyone found their family through the Lost Friends ads, or anyone who did, to report back and let the Lost Friends know so they could share that to encourage other people who were still looking. And so the very last ad in the Book of Lost Friends is a reunion ad. I have not done a study, and I don't know if the keepers of the database at the Historic New Orleans Collection have or not, on what percentage, or whether there was a percentage of people who submitted the reunion ads or said they, we'll never know, because there were probably many who just didn't report back if they did find somebody. So I think we'll never really know what percentage of the people found their relatives. It was definitely in that day and time an incredibly difficult proposition. Time, distance, money, communication, all of those things. But also one of the things many people wanted to do once they were emancipated was pick a new name. They had finally control of what they were going to be called by. And a lot of them picked a new name. So you get 10 years past the Civil War, a lot of people are going by completely different names than what their last known name was by their family.
And you touch on that a little bit in the book of Hanny. She talks about it. How she finds, okay, I'm not giving anything away. Don't worry. they end up in this town, and it's freed slaves, and she's like, this is nice. I could live here. I could be one of these people. Everybody's really nice here. This could be, I could give up on what I'm doing, and I could just be here, and I could choose a new name. And so she thinks about it. Why am I still using this name that somebody else gave me? Somebody who has no longer has any control over my life. And then she talks about how, why am I still calling them Missy or Master? Not even Master, Mr. or Missy. And why am I doing that? I shouldn't be showing them the respect. They don't deserve respect. What was it like to write from a slave's perspective? Did you employ sensitivity readers?
So the thing I employed the most, yes, we did have sensitivity readers after the manuscript was done. The thing I employed the most to write Hanny was just lots of research. The great thing about historical is you have those voices of lived experience to go back to. So in other words, texts that were written in the day. I read everything I could get a hold of from that was written by people who this was their lived experience. Being enslaved was their lived experience. And also, and one of the other, so I read all the books I could get a hold of that were actually written back in the day by people who lived it. Some history texts, but honestly, I prefer the actual voices because I don't really want history filtered through the modern lens of somebody who is aggregating history and writing about it. I want to go back to the voices who lived it, who are telling their experience in their own voices without another filter from modern day. The other place that a lot of the research came from was the WPA slave narratives, which I knew about because I had written a book a few years ago about one of Roosevelt's WPA federal writers, which was a program during the Depression era. It was a WPA program. Some people went out and built bridges. There were also groups of writers hired to go out and just interview ordinary people about their life stories and their work, and just take down the records of ordinary people. And one of the things the WPA writers did was interview the last living people who remembered being enslaved, who had life experience with the years before emancipation. And so there are hundreds of those slave narratives out there, and I read them incessantly as I was doing the research. So there are collections of them that can be bought in books if anybody wants to know. But you can also see them through the Library of Congress. But they're this incredible record of ordinary life during slavery. And I read things in those slave narratives that I didn't read anywhere else. Just details of ordinary life, details of family life, words, phrases that were used by people. I, of course, particularly read the Texas and Louisiana ones that were in the parts of the country I was dealing with the most. But there was so much invaluable information in those that became part of Hanys Story. Everything in Hanys Story came in one way or another from texts written in the time period, including after the time period when they go into the sharecropping years, which was, for most people, another form of economic bondage, basically. And so a lot of people, if they stayed and took on sharecropping, they found themselves in much the same situation, except it was they were economically bound to the sharecropping system and couldn't ever get ahead and get out and get anywhere with it. Terms on that varied widely after the Civil War. So some people did earn out their own land over some time, but a lot of people just worked really hard, could barely survive, and it was a terrible life, basically, a very hard life.
Somebody asked, I guess we weren't real clear. It is a split storyline. Can you talk about the two split storylines? Because we were talking about two characters. I think we need to go into that a little bit more.
Okay. So it is a split storyline, and it's split between 1875, which is Hanny, this girl coming of age, just turning 18, 10 years after the end of the Civil War. And what Hanny's life experience is what happened to a lot of, one of the things you don't think about until you start digging into the historical texts and things like the Lost Friends ads, is there were all these children who are underage as the Civil War ends. And many of them have been separated from their parents, from their siblings, from any blood family. And they are just at the mercy of whatever adults are around them at the time. And the only information most of them have is what the adults around them are telling them. So many of these kids ended up just basically kept by the families who had owned them prior. And so Hanny ends up sharecropping with a bunch of the other strays and this older auntie woman she's not really related to, but who has taken on the strays from Goswood Plantation, and they have this little sharecrop plot. And so that's Hanny's, where we come into Hanny's experience. 18, doesn't know a lot about the world because she's still where she started, knows she has her family out there, has hoped all these years to see her mama coming up the road, because many of these parents walked all over the country. And that was one of the things I found in the slave narratives, walked all over the country to gather up their children, because for the first time, their children belong to them if they can find them and get them back. But nobody ever comes for Hanny. So that's where Hanys Story begins. Waiting all these years, hoping someone would come for her. Nobody ever has. Benny in 1987 is a young teacher who's taken a job in a disadvantaged school district to pay off her student loans as a means of getting her student loans forgiven. Which I knew a lot of people who did back in the day. In 1987 may seem like ancient history to some people, and it may come as a bit of a surprise to you, but I remember 1987 really well. People have asked, why did I set the modern time frame back in 1987? One of the big reasons for that was I remember when the last survivors of the Civil War were marching in parades, et cetera, when the last survivors, and when we were only one generation away from people who had been raised by people who had been enslaved. And so I wanted to get back closer to a time when you would have people still around who had direct experience with the descendants of slavery. And so hence the 1987 timeframe. The 80s also felt like a little more of a, the 60s and 70s were really contentious. Yes, I remember those decades too. The 80s seemed like sort of a respite in there. And so it seemed like a good time to set Benny's story and have her journey into this very difficult school where she has her first year teaching experience. I come from a family of educators, so I know intimately what that first year teaching experience is like. And then if you're completely out of your element, it's even harder. So that's where Benny finds herself as she gets there, without in a school that the nobody's inspired, the necessary materials aren't there. It's more like a prison than a school. And she's desperate to inspire these kids in some way.
If you're just tuning in, I love this book and you should buy it. I put a link in the comments where you can buy it. Support your local bookstore. Let's see here. So I thought a good connection between we talked about familiar stories, and so the fear of losing family stories and pulling family perspectives together. Benny does a school project trying to get her kids interested in their history and just interested in learning. And she has them compile family stories and do kind of what do we call them? I forget what we called them here when my kids did. Statues, and they reenacted people. And they also have, they do, family tree projects in school. my kids, because we foster, and so we would do family tree projects, and the foster kids, they would always get heartbroken because they don't have family trees, they don't have family stories. So we would tell them, oh well, you can borrow ours. And I know, like, now, like in the future, they will be upset because they don't necessarily have a family that they can, when anyway. So one of the kids that struck me in your story, he came from a foster home, and he didn't necessarily have a family story. And that reminded me of your previous book, talking about foster kids and how they lose their stories. And can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's definitely one of the that comes from a few places in life. I've always worked with youth. We've always lived, or we've lived most of our adult lives in small towns. So you get all kinds of people mixed together, and those people are going to be in your Sunday school and on, the kids are all on baseball teams together, because in a small town, it takes all the kids to make a baseball team or whatever. So you don't have the luxury. I grew up in the suburbs of a big city, and, in the suburbs, everybody is kind of like you. They're about the same income level. Their parents do some kind of job somewhat similar to your parents' job. They live in a house about like yours. Everybody's kind of the opposite of homogenized, whatever that would be, separated into similar type groups in the places they live. Small towns are the opposite. Small towns are homogenized because they're small, because everybody's in close proximity, because there's not, the small town can't exist that way. So we had a lot of bonus kids over the years at our house. We had a lot of kids from tough situations who would stay a week at a time because there were reasons not to be at home. So I've seen a lot of that, and been involved in a lot of that, and been involved with a lot of kids just trying to help do anything, basically doing what Benny's doing, trying to hit on anything that will inspire a kid to see his or her potential. And the idea that, you can write your own story, and sometimes you just have to. And it is incredibly hard for them. The loss of your family history, of your family story, is incredibly difficult. And I see that so much now, because I've been, after Before We Were Yours came out, one of the things that happened was I started hearing from the real life survivors of the Tennessee Children's Home Society adoptions. And many of them, some of them had been able to go on and find their birth family information. But many of them would get in touch with me because this was either the first time they realized what that Tennessee Children's Home Society adoption means. And what it means is your documents are quite likely fraudulent. The story you've been told about your parents dying in a car wreck, and so they couldn't raise you and you were put up for adoption, is quite likely not true. You may have relatives out there. You may have a family out there. The birth name of the name of your birth mother that you've been given, she may have a completely different name in history. You may have a different ethnic history than what you've been told on your documents. So one of the things we've been able to do is connect some of those people up with resources. And we've watched them go through, or walked through that search process beside them, as these people in their 70s and 80s and 90s finally, for the first time, many of whom had happy adoptions, but they finally, for the first time, they still want to know their genetic history, their biological history. Where do they come from? What's their ancestor history? And we've been able to walk through that process with people who have gone their whole lives and not known, and sometimes also with next generation. So the sons and daughters or grandchildren of people who never had their biological history in their family. And, it's amazing to see people for the first time be able to go lay flowers at the grave of a birth mother, or know what her name is, or talk to relatives who have family photos. To see someone in their 80s get a family photo for the first time of someone who looks like them is just, it tells you how much you can have had a great life. You can have raised your own family. You can have had a great adoption, but it still matters to know what your family history is. And, in some ways, that's what Benny's trying to give back to these kids whose family histories have been lost because they haven't been told. There's so, we still need that. That's part of defining who we are. And so part of that is that journey for these kids in the story back to knowing their family histories.
So I have a question here, which is actually my next one. What are you working on next?
Oh, what am I working on next? Right now, launching this book. But there's a piece of history, another one of those mind-blowing pieces of history that's turning around in my head. And my next project is to dig into the research for that and find out more, because sometimes the story comes just right away, how the story would be told, but it often, like Hanys' story, comes out of a little bit of digging into the research and then starting to hear the voice of someone who would tell the story. Before We Were Yours was the same way, because I had sort of a big idea, but I was like, in a novel, who would tell this story? And somewhere in the research, I came across the information about Georgia Tann raiding these shanty boat camps on the river, where the shanty boaters would draw up at Mud Island and have their camps. And, that sparked Rill and her family, because I thought, what a completely different kind of existence to come out of and end up in these orphan houses in a world that you don't even really understand, because you haven't participated in it. You've been living in this world of the river shanty boat people who had their own kind of world. And so, a lot of times a little bit of the research generates the character, generates the storyteller for the story.
Well, I really enjoyed it. I'm in the middle of your last book. I admit, since I have ties to the foster community, I've been putting off reading it, but I have personally sold so many copies that I think you paid for our new floors when we expanded our store. And they're very nice.
I hope so. Good.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for coming. You were amazing. You're so eloquent. I love it. Your books are amazing. We sell you. I hand sell you all the time. I really enjoyed. People, if you're watching, you need to read this book. It is so good, and it will totally take your mind off of everything that's going on. Please buy your books from independent bookstores. Support them. They need you right now. Thank you, Lisa, for coming. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Have a good day.
Thank you.